Hello, everybody, and welcome to the London Shipping Law Centre's Young Maritime Professionals Global Webinar Series with 4Pump Court, and this year's Shipping Industry Forum webinar. It's usually held in person, but obviously, like everything else, this year it is a webinar. My name is Andrew Stevens. I'm a barrister at 4Pump Court, and I'm very excited to have a great group of speakers for this year's summit. We'll be starting off with Alexander Gray from Ferrari, who is a specialist P&I insurance broker. In fact, let me get rid of this slide so that you can see the people. So we'll have Alexander Gray, who is a specialist P&I insurance broker at Ferrari. Revecca, Vasiliou, Divisional Claims Director at the Standard Club. Thinn, Nyunt, an associate at Reed Smith in London. I'll say something. And finally, Ross Crouch, a senior director at Watkins Associates, will finish off. Hopefully there'll be Q&A at the end. You can hopefully submit the chat function. And Francesca Cappa, the YMP chair, will say something very briefly at the end. I should say that Kelly Wadkins of Watkins Associates is unfortunately not able to join us as billed at the very last minute, but Ross Crouch is a very able deputy who has spoken at this event before, and we're very lucky to have him again this time. Before I hand over to the speakers, some of you will have attended this event before, some not. So I just wanted to say something about the context and aims of the forum. So it's organised on behalf of the YMP, and the Y stands for Young Maritime Professionals. So it's aimed primarily at the Y in the YMP, people starting out in their careers in shipping professions, or even those 5 to 10 years into their careers. But as somebody who, you might not be able to see it, but genuinely has greying hair and fall just outside of the category that I mentioned, I can say that I always find this event very useful. In that context, each speaker has been asked to say a little bit about what they do, how they got into it, and how they and their organizations work as part of the shipping ecosystem. And this can be of benefit, of course, to those getting into their careers, helping them to build up an overall market understanding. But also, for example, and there may be some of you on here right now who fit into this category, those 5, maybe even 10 years into their career, let's say at a law firm or a chambers, who are too embarrassed now to say that they've never quite been sure what a club does or what drives a club commercially. So we're very lucky to have Revecca and also Alex to speak about that. Furthermore, that covering the fundamentals of what we all do can also help those looking to progress or to change careers within shipping. But the main topic that the speakers are asked to address this year is the state of their market, the market from their point of view. So obviously the impact of COVID on their part of the shipping ecosystem will be covered, and the changes over the year, the trends and the future. That is fascinating to all in the audience, not just the young. So without any further ado, I shall hand over to Alex and Revecca.
Cool. Thank you very much, Andrew, and thanks for the invitation today. So Revecca and I kind of cross over quite a bit, so we thought it would be better just to go through things together, because we may cross over on occasion. But as Andrew mentioned, I'll give a quick overview of my career to date, I suppose. I graduated at Southampton, having studied law. And as it was Southampton, you'd probably be unsurprised, there was the options of shipping and corporate and carriage of goods by sea modules. So having did that, I started my career at the Standard P&I Club as a claims executive. Whilst I was there, I did my master's and my LPC with my training contract running alongside. So rather unusually, I did my solicitor training in-house at the club. After that, I moved to Inson&Co in Monaco. Was in private practice for 2 years. That's where I came across Thinn, who was at London Club in the London office at the time. For personal reasons, I then wanted to move back to London, so I joined the UK P&I Club. After a year there, they asked me to do a stint in Greece, But whilst I was there, I was talking with Ferrari. So I'd known them for about a decade. I handled claims with them at the Standard Club. In Monaco, their office was next door. I was friends with them in Greece. So some would say it was inevitable. But I've now been here for 2 years and really enjoying it. But I actually came across Revecca when I worked at the Standard Club. We were there together. Although we never really talked about how she fell into the industry. So before we go on to the substantive topic, I'll hand over to her for an introduction, if that's okay.
Thanks, Alex. My career seems a bit simple compared to your kind of variety of background, but I studied law at university, and I was at Bristol, and I had the option of choosing shipping law as a module, and I chose it and just clicked with the subject really. So when I was looking for a training contract, I looked for a firm that I could do a seat in shipping with. And then on qualification, I joined Thomas Cooper, where I worked in their shipping department for 5 years. And then I moved on to the club. But I think you mentioned we work together, and shipping is such a small industry. So we've gone from being colleagues in the same club to now working together with you in your new position at PLF. So perhaps you could give us a bit of background as to what you do at PLF and what PLF is.
Yeah, exactly. I've been advised that many may not know what Ferrari is or a P&I insurance broker is. So let's just break it down for a minute. So what is P&I? Effectively, it's the insurance covering third-party liabilities that a ship owner or operator may be exposed. So it protects and indemnifies them, i.e. P&I. So it's a bit like third-party car insurance. It covers everything except your own car. So the lamppost you hit into or potential injuries elsewhere. Those fall into the P&I insurers, which are then going on to the clubs. So I'll hand over to Revecca for that. But the second part of it is what is the broker side of it. Ultimately, brokers are commercial people that put the ship owners and the insurers together. So the sources of the transaction, effectively. So we're someone that connects a client with a suitable product, and we help with the supporting commercial operations of the client and ensuring they have adequate protection in place. So in the past, obviously this year is a bit of an exception, but broker is a connecting person, quite often on a plane, connecting the clients in their place of domicile with the markets that they're placing their risks. So combining those two things together, Ferrari is a P&I broker. So we're consultants for all things related to P&I. P&I insurance renews on the 20th of February. That's a historical date. Traditionally, that was the date on which the Baltic Sea ice melted and ships were able to trade again. So it's a bit like, you know, a new year for shipping. And then where Ferrari comes in is that in the same way that a lawyer advises a client of a contractual dispute, or a fuel expert analyzes and advises on the outcome of an analysis, we advise on all matters related to P&I insurance. So our consultancy remit, so to speak, ranges from anything from the actual insurance structure in place, so whether it's right to sit in a club or another market, the financial structure that's needed, are the right excess layers, so how much a ship owner pays for each claim himself, and the total limited liability, so the total amount of protection they have. Assisting with the issuance of documentation. Now, this is effectively the ship owner's tickets to trade. So in order to trade, they need to be compliant with bunker blue card regulations, maritime labour convention certificates, and they need to have those documentation certificates on board to trade. And then finally, we will also handle and assist with handling a claim as and when it applies, and the rules themselves, so the rules of P&I clubs or the insurance policy. So when an owner has an issue, we will consider it and renew it and review it. And then if something falls within the scope of P&I insurance, we would then work with and present it to the P&I club for whatever is required under that policy. So usually it's real-time assistance or even after the event advice. But I'll hand over to Revecca to go into more detail about an actual working of a club and where you guys get involved.
Thanks, Alex. You've already explained that P&I insurance covers third-party liabilities, and the main areas we cover are injury and illness to crew and third parties, including the repatriation of crew, collision liability, liability to third-party cargo, pollution, we cover certain fines and also elements of cargo's proportion of GA and salvage. All clubs are mutual organisations, and we work on the basis of pay to be paid, which essentially means the club shouldn't be able to be sued directly by the claimants. It will be the member that's sued and we reimburse the member. And our limits of cover can go up to $7 billion. In terms of claims handling, for P&I matters, I would say the club is probably one of the first responders. We'll receive a call or an email from a member or their broker notifying us of an incident, and we very quickly come up with a plan of how we're going to deal with the claim. And quite often this involves us activating our local correspondents, local experts and surveyors just to get an idea of what's happening. The club will coordinate all these parties in the reporting lines, and will also provide an initial legal advice for the member to best protect their position. For more serious matters, major casualties, pollutions, we do have a major casualty response plan, and it's not unusual for claims handlers to go to the site of the incident and liaise with the authorities, help coordinate the team to help things run as smoothly as possible. In addition to P&I, we also have defence cover. This is slightly different in that we don't insure the underlying dispute. We actually cover the costs, so that's lawyers' costs, experts' costs, tribunal costs in pursuing or defending a shipping-related claim, which doesn't actually fall within the P&I policy. So just to give a very basic example, if we have an off-hire claim, of course, the hire is the member's money or it's their liability. So we're not insuring that. We're actually covering the costs needed to be able to fight or defend that claim. I would say that a lot of our claims handlers are legally qualified, so we do a lot of defence work in-house. But obviously when matters become more complex, when we're looking at arbitrations and court matters, we do work with external lawyers and counsel, and I think Thinn will touch on that later when she does her section of the talk. But Alex, you know this, you've worked for the club, the law firm and the brokers. And so how have you found the move between the different firms and difference in roles?
Yeah, you say it's quite unique or even rather odd to take the moves that I have. I never thought that going from a P&I claims handler or even a lawyer would cross into the broking world. The typical moves are either on the commercial side, so between an underwriter and a broker or vice versa, or on the legal side, so law firm to a club, and again vice versa, because they're very transferable skills. I've kind of completely gone the other way around. So I started in P&I club and then went into private practice. So the training at a club, you're sort of thrown into the deep end in a good way, because you're dealing with clients directly from day one, receiving calls 24/7 and expected to act and provide the practical assistance that's needed. And then again, you connect the right people, so you'd appoint a lawyer where it's needed on a specific claim or an expert. So to be honest, I never thought it would end up or move towards the broking side, which is far more commercial at the source of a transaction, the front end rather than the back end. I didn't really look for a career in broking. I wasn't joining a broking house, I was joining Ferrari, because you don't really see many other brokers as involved, especially on the claim side, as you would do. So they were the only broker that I really had day-to-day experience with. So I never really joined or looked to be a broker. Instead, it was joining Ferrari. And here I'm getting involved in a little bit of everything, from looking at new business, assisting with the renewal of P&I insurance terms for new and existing clients, assisting on the legal side where needed, or a second pair of eyes on a claim if it's appropriate, and generally getting involved where it is needed. But I mean, Revecca, you were the other way around, so you were private practice in a club, so you probably got a slightly different perspective.
Yeah, I left the private practice about 5 years PQE to join the club. I think at that point I felt that I had a good grounding in the legal principles, but really I wanted more exposure to owners, charterers and and the commercial world. And I'd worked with P&I clubs, obviously, at the law firm, and I also had a lot of friends working in P&I clubs. So I was just becoming more and more intrigued about the work they were doing and thought it would be something that would suit me. And I would say that the pace at the club was quite different from the law firm. We really are on call 24/7 for our members. We handle a high volume of cases compared to what I was handling at the law firm. And also the variety of work that I've been doing at the club, I do wet and dry work. So it's given me great exposure to lots of different types of work and cases. But I think one of the big things I enjoy about the club is our relationship with our members. We have longevity. We get to know our members. We get to know their structures, their main terms they trade on. So when there's a problem, we can act really quickly, and we almost are an extension of their operation. So it's really kind of satisfying when you can come up with a quick commercial solution. You can give advice quickly to help the member. And I think that's the part of the job I probably enjoy most. But I think the events of 2020 have taught us that all service providers really need to collaborate and pull together to give the members the best service we can. They've been trading in extremely difficult times. So I think, Alex, now you'll take us through some of the events we've seen in 2020, just to give everyone an idea of what we've been doing and what we've been seeing.
Sure, no, definitely. So now we're moving on to the COVID side of things, the substantive part of today's topic. And having spoken with Revecca before, we were talking about taking it in two different parts, so the commercial side and then the operational side. So how revenues have changed in different sectors, and then things like day-to-day management of the vessel. So from the commercial side and from a broking perspective, we do things rather differently. Our relationships with clients are unusual when you consider, an hourly charge by a lawyer or an expert. We also don't have the revenues of the actual premium itself. Instead, we have individual arrangements with individual clients. But ultimately, if we don't place the risk, i.e. the P&I insurance, if it's not placed through us, then brokers don't profit from that. So how has COVID affected that? Well, the more ships that are out there trading, then the better it is, because they need insurance to do that. COVID certainly affected some sectors very hard. We're particularly looking at sort of the cruise and passenger vessels. So for some lines, they just stopped overnight because there was no need for them, whether it be your large cruise liners, which were put into layup, and layup being they're not operating navigationally, they are staying still and they're not operational. So for the reasons for insurance, the amount that is actually paid in premium may be reduced or in some cases ceased entirely. So that would then affect the broking world, because there may not be the opportunities to place the same insurance as you did before. But we have seen there are opportunities elsewhere. So particularly in the non-club markets. So the fixed premium side, especially in the US, many insurers placed their new and indeed existing policies with COVID exclusions. So any losses arising from COVID causes, whether it be personal injury or deviation, or personal injury, illness or deviation, they would not cover the loss. Well, the IG and the group of the P&I clubs have not done that. So the people that we were talking to who weren't quite ready to move into a club then sort of reapproached us and said, actually, the scope of cover is so wide for P&I clubs because of the mutual factor, that it was something that they would look to reconsider. So in some cases, yes, business has suffered because ships are taken out of circulation, out of trading. But in other circumstances where the industry is unaffected, then it's provided a different product to the market that wasn't necessarily in consideration before. But there have been some markets that have been relatively unaffected. I mean, we're talking about, I may be brave in saying this, but tankers have seen less of an effect than many other sectors, because the oil war at the beginning of the year sort of put all the tankers into circulation, performing all these voyages. And then when the cabotage effect started to happen, which is where you're buying oil at a cheap price to then put it into a ship as floating storage and wait for the market to rise, the ships were all still being utilized effectively. They're still being hired. So they may have seen an issue on an operational side, But from a commercial side, that is a sector unlike the cruise and passenger sector, where they have seen possibly more of a trade than they would have done otherwise. So it's very different on the commercial side in terms of the initial panic of the market, all these insurance exclusions that were placed on new and existing policies in comparison to the commercial side of the different sectors that we work with. But I touched upon the cruise and passenger and the tanker side of things. But I think, Revecca, you've probably seen more of the bulk of the general cargo side of things. So what's happening in that area?
Yeah, I mean, definitely at the start of the year, if we take it in order, we weren't seeing any positive cases of COVID on board the ships, generally because the crew weren't leaving the ship, and shore personnel were very restricted in the way in which they could go on board the ships. What we did see at the beginning of the year is that owners were having, and crew managers were having, great difficulty in arranging crew changes, and in most cases it had almost become impossible. I think no one knew how long this pandemic would go on and how long the restrictions would last, but there were already crew at that time that were almost at the end of their contracts and were staying on board longer than they should have been. We were also finding problems when crew were ill on board for non-COVID related cases, heart attacks, strokes, and incidents like that. The usual course of event would be to deviate the ship and get that seafarer to hospital as soon as we can. But what we found, especially at the beginning of the year, is that hospitals and ports weren't allowing seafarers in. So sometimes a ship was trying 2-3 ports before we could get the seafarer the treatment they needed. And in some very sad cases where seafarers passed away, we weren't able to repatriate their bodies straight away, and bodies were remaining on board the ships for quite long periods of time, which was distressing for everybody involved. But I would say at the beginning of the year, because nobody knew of this pandemic, we didn't know how long it would last, how long the regulations would be changing for. We just saw a huge variety of queries. Owners and crew managers obviously needed to plan ahead. So they needed certainty from their insurers, they needed certainty in regulations in order to be able to plan for commercial reasons and for the well-being of the seafarers. So we saw huge collaboration amongst the IG clubs, amongst international bodies, amongst brokers, to try and get the information to the members as quickly as we could obtain it and help support members as much as we can. When we moved into the second quarter, beginning of March, the UN task force had been set up, and in about May time, seafarers were given key worker status. And we also started to see some green shoots in that some ports were opening up and allowing crew changes, but under very restricted circumstances. BIMCO also, in record time, I think, for BIMCO, produced a charter party clause that can be used in time charter parties to help allow owners to have the right to deviate to effect crew changes. And I think we were one of the clubs that helped in the drafting of that clause. And at the same time, from an underwriting point of view, all clubs took a wider approach to what they saw as a reasonable deviation, so that the owners could not have their cover affected by an unreasonable deviation. Towards the summer, so we're looking into the third quarter now, after we'd seen a slight easing of restrictions on crew changes, we saw this starting to harden again. And at this point, there really were thousands of crew who were stranded on board ships, not able to get home, and they were well beyond their contractual periods for being on board the ship. And not only that, they were actually performing duties that they wouldn't normally be performing. A lot of shore personnel were restricted from going on board, so the crew were actually doing extra duties. And we might have seen it in the press that some crew actually started to strike. And I think whilst we know that suicides, injuries, illnesses and accidents, they're not new at all at sea, but we definitely think the pandemic has increased these, but to what extent we don't yet know. And we also saw a rise in defence disputes. I think one of the main disputes we were seeing is that charters were very reluctant to allow owners to deviate the ship to change the crew, and often refused permission, or if they did allow, if they were aware of it, they would put owners on notice that they don't agree agree for it, and that all consequences will be for owners as a result of the unauthorised deviation. So this was putting a lot of responsibility on owners. Often they would arrange a deviation plan which looked quite simple, that wouldn't take very long, but the crew might have changed their status of COVID, and they might suddenly find a positive test. Regulations can change. So whilst an owner or a crew manager will make one plan, it's constantly evolving and changing, which creates a lot of tension with charterers and their sub-charterers. There's also delays at lots of the ports and a lot of the ship repair yards, and again that created a lot of disputes for off-hire and delay claims. And I think all year we've obviously had casualties and salvage operations which have been made a lot harder because personnel haven't been able to travel as easily as they would ordinarily. We're now in the fourth quarter. The IMO has produced a further protocol. Charterers still seem very reluctant to allow the changes. And seafarers' health and well-being remains the main concern, not only for their own health, but in the safety of operating the ships. We're seeing fines being imposed on owners for crew-related requirements. And I think owners and crew managers really are working in very uncertain times. Regulations keep changing, goalposts keep moving. It's very, very expensive for them to arrange different crew changes. They'll make the arrangements, something changes, they then have to make new arrangements. Not only is that a frustration for owners and crew managers, it's also a frustration for the crew when they're told, okay, at the next port, you'll be able to get off and go home, to suddenly be told, no, the plan's changed, that can't happen. It's very demoralising for the crew members. The good news is there is now a vaccine, and we wait to see how quickly this can be rolled out to seafarers. So that was a very, very quick run through of the issues that the club's been seeing and still facing. So I think I'm going to pass over to Thinn now, who give her, I think you're briefly, Thinn, you're going to talk about kind of your career and how you kind of reached your job where you are now. And I think also you did a secondment with a club, so Thinn will give her view on how clubs and put clubs and law firms cross over. And finally, I think she'll go on to some COVID-related issues. So Thinn, I'll pass over to you now.
Thank you. Yes, that was really interesting to hear, both from Alex and from Revecca about sort of earlier stage, how all the insurances are put into place and what that actually means. In terms of myself, my name's Thinn. I'm an associate at Reed Smith. I first started studying law at university, similar to the other speakers, and while researching law firms, came across a graduate recruitment brochure which described as the typical day of a shipping lawyer. It set out things to do with collisions, oil pollutions, piracy. All sounded very interesting. Not what I do now, but enough to entice me into it. I then was able to secure some work experience at Reed Smith, and then paralegaled in the shipping group, as it was called then, in disputes. And similar to Alex, I was studying my LPC part-time, so getting to learn the theory and put it straight into practice. And it really got to see what the life of a trainee solicitor and a solicitor is as well. So particularly as a paralegal, prepared lots of bundles, compiled exhibits, legal research, reviewed a lot of disclosure as well. I then completed my training contract at Ince & Co, which is where I met Alex. And now as a solicitor in the transportation group, I predominantly focus on dispute resolution and dry disputes. So sort of very broadly, the transportation group at Reed Smith is split into dispute resolution and asset finance. So although I do predominantly dry work, which is contractual disputes, I also have colleagues who deal with what we call wet work, which is the collisions, investigations, incident casualties, that kind of work. And I also have the asset finance colleagues who deal with actually helping with deals, structuring them, and advising different parties with interests in investing in the maritime market. So on a sort of day-to-day basis, as I sort of do primarily deal in dispute resolution, our clients are a mix of, we might be contacted directly by owners or operators, ship managers or commodities trading houses. And then quite often, we might be contacted by P&I clubs on their behalf, or where it's a ship manager, their insurers. So there's quite a few different people that we sort of liaise with in the market, and we are involved at quite often from an early stage, depending on the nature of the dispute. If it's a very large one or complex, then we might be involved sort of straight away from the beginning. It might be that a club or an insurer is helping advise on that initial stage, and then we're involved where it's after arbitration has been commenced, or we're looking at starting a commercial court claim. So our role really is to sort of help assess legal merits and advise on strategy, and help obtain remedies and minimise any losses depending on the position of the party involved. So in the short term, that might involve looking longer term. For example, when we're looking at arbitration or commercial court, we would be looking at obtaining security as soon as possible, so that we can ensure, at the end of any successful, hopefully, resolution of a dispute, that we can actually enforce against assets. And that might involve, if it's a claim against an owner with a fleet of vessels, we might look at a vessel arrest, and that will involve instructing local lawyers to be able to trace the vessel, liaise with the local courts to get that in place. It might be instructing a third-party asset tracer to have a look to see if there's some bunkers or any other assets that we can attach. And once all that is secure, we'd look at actually progressing the claim itself, and depending upon the nature of the claim, there might be different applications that arise. So as far as possible, we try and at an earlier stage try and identify what issues we could progress more quickly. So if there are preliminary issues in relation to kind of legal interpretation or quantum or something that might be able to unlock a dispute, we try and focus on that to try and get that resolved first. And in terms of those different methods of dispute resolution, we might be involved in mediation. So in addition to the sort of formal arbitration process or commercial court process, we might rather than instruct, appoint a mediator, and that can be in the traditional form of a day period where the parties are all in one room bashing it out, or it could be what we're seeing an increase of is something called early intervention mediation, which is lots of smaller meetings spread out over a longer period of time, where the parties are able to, if they want to go and investigate further, or maybe discuss with other people in their organisation, or with experts, or with us. It just is a sort of slightly different way of mediating that dispute. So as Revecca mentioned, I also spent 6 months on secondment to a P&I club last year, and I was primarily dealing with defence claims. And that was very interesting. As Revecca said, you get a lot of claims from day one. I had never sort of spoken to as many people on the phone until I sat in the club receiving calls all day. And the dynamic is very different, because people want immediate advice, and you don't have the opportunity to say, actually, let me look at the case law for 2 hours. You've got to respond quite quickly. And the club environment is very supportive of that. Everyone has a wealth of experience, and you've got loss prevention and lots of experts. So the provision of that advice is very different, and it's something that is interesting to compare, having come back, where we also obviously do coordinate lots of experts and arrange technical advice, which essentially is done with a lot more time to it. So an expert will have, you know, a few weeks at least, maybe even months, to prepare their report, to look through every document in close detail. And you know, and when we involve barristers, they similarly also have more time to kind of consider things through, consider strategy, consider legal authorities. In terms of kind of other solicitors as well, while we're talking about the solicitor role, as I mentioned, I have colleagues who deal with wet disputes, and so they might be involved, similar to the club, they might be involved right at the early investigation. They might be called out to attend, take evidence, help preserve evidence as well. And that's something that during this pandemic, you know, has moved to something that is a sort of remote virtual possibility. And, you know, with that, it's something that we're hoping, you know, it's an option, but obviously there are also advantages to being there in person. So that's something that has been a bit of a change in the way that we work, and you know, in terms of virtual arbitrations, virtual mediations, and also virtual investigation. And you know, similar to the club, particularly at the beginning of sort of around March, we saw lots of queries in relation to crew-related issues, not only in the disputes, but also in relation to the finance work that we do. So where people are purchasing second-hand vessels, or you know, and needing to kind of get the crew off to be able to actually sell that vessel, or you know, get it transferred. And so that involved a lot of negotiation as to how that transition would work. Obviously required prospective purchasers to be quite flexible about that, you know, and it was in both parties' interests to do so, assuming that they still wanted to take the vessel. Otherwise, you know, we do, in terms of the future and what we're seeing at the moment, we anticipate that there will be kind of maybe larger disputes coming out of this. At the moment, there is a bit of a sort of longer tail in terms of when claims are then instructed out to lawyers once they're clearly a clear dispute that cannot be resolved. So at the moment, we've all been quite busy on a lot of our existing work, but continuing to see new things, including bunker-related claims, quality claims that are coming through, and ones relating to changeover procedures as a result of the changes in IMO 2020 bunker related procedures. So we're starting to see quite a number of those, you know, from sort of around summer coming through to us, and likely to keep going forward. So on that, I think I'll hand over to Andrew now to also talk about the you know, when there is a definite dispute and a barrister's involved.
Thanks, Thinn. That was really excellent, and the same applies to Revecca and Alex. Enlightening, really useful to hear about. I am going to do the naughty thing of putting my phone on loud in the background with a timer on, so that we very quickly get to Ross, who is, I'm sure, far more interesting than me. So I shall jump straight in with 6 minutes on the clock. What does a barrister do, and how does one get into it, and why? To answer that question, I thought I would compare what I hoped to do with what I actually do, to see whether I do what I wanted to do, and to give you a view of what it is that a barrister does. At school, at university, I wanted a cerebral, intellectual job, but I also wanted a commercial one. I didn't want a purely commercial one. So law seemed of interest. And for rather geeky historical reasons, I've long been interested in global trade. Don't ask me why. After my law degree, or during it, I was studying Mandarin. I went to China, and I was touring factories, getting to visit as many factories and ports and shipping companies as I could, just to see how the world works. And when I was there, I went to one factory where the owner came bounding down the steps and said, "Are you this law student?" I said, "Yes, I am." said, do you speak German? I thought, what on earth has that got to do with anything? Funnily enough, yes, I do. And he said, great, because all of our machinery is from Germany and it's not working properly. So we want to sue the Germans. Can you come and read the contract? So I said, well, I'm not qualified, but gladly. So I went and read the contract, and it had in it an English law clause and an arbitration clause. And there and then I thought, bingo, this is what I want to do. I want to do international arbitration related to global trade. And I researched it and found out that shipping is a very obvious way into international arbitration, because so much shipping work is in arbitration, or disputes are determined through arbitration, at least initially. So I targeted shipping. So do I do an intellectual job that involves being very commercial and getting to see how global trade works? Yes, that's essentially the job of a barrister in a nutshell, in terms of the overview. In terms of how I fit into the ecosystem, my clients, or the clients of barristers, are lawyers, essentially. There are some exceptions. We can take direct instructions from certain companies or individuals. It's a big hassle. I tend not to do that. It's possible. But essentially our clients are lawyers, qualified lawyers, mostly in firms, sometimes in clubs, but most of the time in firms. And essentially the barrister acts for the lay client of our client. And so the law firms that I work with, is it international? Is it global? Yes. UK firms, US, Norway, French, a lot of Chinese, Indian law firms, and so on. It's very international. If there's English law involved, or English language advocacy, even with foreign law, we can get involved, or I have got involved. And their clients, often with me, they're from China, or often also the US and Norway and Finland and India, Singapore, you name it. In shipping, the company can be from anywhere, including offshore jurisdictions. But often the ultimate client is a club in shipping work, or at least if the club isn't necessarily calling the shots, they might be funding it. So somewhere along the line, there might be a club involved. And I feel very lucky to have this job, because having had an outside interest, paying to go to China to learn the language, to see how it worked, I now essentially get paid to meet with the chairman of a big Far Eastern company and discuss what they do in their particular commercial problem and how we resolve it in dispute resolution. So I'm phenomenally lucky to do what I do. What exactly does a barrister do? My auntie once said to me, don't you just sit around drinking wine all day? I don't know where she got that from. I certainly don't. But essentially, I think we do three things. 1, oral advocacy. 2, written advocacy. 3, specific pieces of advice. There may be other things that we do, but generally that's all I can think of. Oral advocacy, in the last 18 months, I've had in-person hearings, virtual hearings, hybrid virtual hearings. I'll come back onto that. And also I had a hearing out in Shenzhen in China, and a Hong Kong hearing as well. So very international. Used to get to travel a lot, or travel by Zoom now. Written advocacy, a very senior QC once told me, in a dispute, everything is advocacy, including what you write to the other side. So all the applications you make. So it might be advising about how to make an application, whether to make an application, whether to pull back from something, or how you draft the witness statement or a letter. That's the kind of thing that a barrister does, as well as the sort of oral wearing a wig and a gown. I never do it, or very rarely. But that's what people think of as the oral side. Specific advice, sometimes people come to us and say, there's this clause. How would a tribunal interpret it? Should we change it? Should we agree to it? We've agreed to it? Have it been done? Whatever they ask, there are specific pieces of advice that might be sought from us. Changes. I'm very lucky to do not just shipping work. I do a lot of shipping, shipbuilding, construction, energy, fraud, a real kind of spectrum of commercial work. But the changes in shipping, I would say the start of the year, it was same as just dealing with sort of a train of big cases that had been rumbling through for years, or at least many months. The big change initially was the shift to virtual hearings. They involve the same skills, but packaged in a different way, and preparation in a different way. There we go. That's my 6 minutes. I'm going to give myself 1.5 more minutes, then I'm done. So that's been a big change, virtual hearings. There's an hour-long seminar at least in how to prepare for virtual hearings. Very happy to give it. But it's a different beast, but the same stuff, just repackaged. When COVID happened, in terms of the impact on work on my desk, there were a lot of advices, a lot of requests for advice about delay, about demurrage, about force majeure. Oh gosh, if I did a keyword search for force majeure in my inbox around March, April, it would come up a lot. And termination. And this was on a range of things, from vessels sitting outside a port, not knowing what to do, to a massive energy project. Should we just pull the plug? Has there been force majeure? So it's something a question that popped into a lot of lawyers and clients' minds. Now I find that some disputes have COVID in the facts and on some of their sub issues, but a lot of the new stuff isn't necessarily directly driven by COVID. But what I am finding increasingly, especially over the last couple of months, is where there's been fraud in the background or failing companies in the background, things are coming home to roost, and it's giving rise to disputes and even freezer applications and so on. That has been a growing part of my work in the last few months, and I think there could be a long-term trend there if we're supposed to talk about what we see coming in the future. I think things where deals have not been quite as strong as they might have been, we might see things coming unstuck. But otherwise, I'm a step beyond Thinn in terms of my removal from the coal face of a dispute happening. So there's a long time lag to things getting to me. And for instance, who remembers Deepwater Horizon in 2011, the terrible tragic events, loss of life, massive oil spill? 2011, just a couple of weeks ago, a case I was involved in the Supreme Court, Halliburton and Chubb, the decision came out. That's from 2011. So who knows where what is happening today will be with us in 5 or 10 years' time. I think that sums it up for me. But the biggest change, I think, is how cash flow is affecting current parties' involvement in litigation. Even if you've been on a case for a while, COVID and the economic impacts is affecting people's view of whether they want to pay for a dispute or not. So I did see a lot of settlements earlier in the year of things that were historical disputes. That may impact how disputes evolve, but otherwise, look out for fraud is what I would say. And I can now hand over to Ross to round off with his view from the world of employment consultancy in the shipping and maritime sector.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks to everyone else who's presented. How long have I got, Andrew? Just what's the clock?
So I would say 10 minutes as per the plan.
Lovely, great. So I suppose just to keep it consistent, a brief talk about me and how I came into my particular role at Watkins and Associates. I originally, my background's separate career, if you like, was in property. I was a property director for a number of years with Savills, so a different turn aside from legal. The last 2, maybe 3 years of my time with Savills, I was charged with heading up their internal and centralising their internal recruitment. So essentially, some of you may well be familiar with the general principle that you can either go to external agency like Watkins Associates, or others will have lateral, or both will have lateral in-house functions. So Savills were looking, I did a number of hires into the Savills business in my remit as a director, and we were looking to bring on board someone to centralise that recruitment function. I think having been part of the hiring and looking for the right individual, I then put my name forward. So the last 2-3 years, Savills UK, I worked on centralising their recruitment function quite successfully, I should add. It's still going strong, which is always a good sign. And then, I'm trying to think now, just over 3 years ago, which feels like a lifetime ago, I met Kelly Wadkins of Watkins Associates, who sadly can't be with us today, but I listened to her vision, her knowledge and specialist insight into the transport, legal transport and energy market, which is solely what we focus on. So very specialist, dare I say niche. I think that helps us both on the client and the candidate side. It certainly seems to. But I, having always, I suppose, harboured an interest in legal and all things legal and the workings, thought it sounded like a really unique offering and something, you know, where you can really make a difference and get to know a market. I think for my part, it can sometimes be very tough when you're broad and you're quite generalist to actually get an understanding and the layers of what you guys do, and it's been really interesting to hear from all of you today. But likewise, the ramifications, whether it's a pandemic like now and the impact we've seen on a market, or other things that will happen, and there will always be impacts in various different, whether it's on the contentious side or the finance side. So it's been a successful and very positive move for me into Watkins Associates. Really enjoy it. I enjoy speaking to people in the market, whether that be a partner, whether that be any of the, whether it's someone just taking up a paralegal in the market or someone looking at a newly qualified, looking to build out their career. It's great to give the best possible advice, and obviously we can see how the different journeys, and it's been interesting to hear about some of your routes into your own careers and own roles now. People do come, there isn't a set route. It's about offering people the best possible advice, which I really enjoy. From a market perspective, and certainly where we are now, it's very difficult, I think, to talk about the last year without mentioning the C word, being COVID, and how things have evolved from there. If I look back, and I don't know about everyone else, it feels like a lifetime ago now. If I look back to the early onset of COVID, and it probably became apparent in our market that there was an awareness of what was coming, perhaps not to the right degree in the early part of this calendar year. I think as soon as we hit lockdown, there was a shift. The market naturally became opportunity-led, where there were far fewer opportunities. There were a lot of individuals offerings trying to get their head, as we all were, around what was going on and what would be the potential and indeed wider impact of COVID on the market. From a contentious perspective, I think in the early part of lockdown, it was interesting again to hear Revecca and Alex in particular talk about P&I clubs, because I think we were probably seeing that P&I clubs were the most active in the contentious side, on the contentious side of the market at the beginning of lockdown. They made the most and hired some very good talent in what was, as I say, an opportunity-led market with far fewer opportunities out there. They were able to onboard some very, very talented individuals into those teams. I think as we progressed into the summer months, we started to see that litigation was busy. And at that point, you were seeing, namely the boutique firms, and indeed as the summer months grew, some of the smaller firms who just didn't have the same ability to spread out and share work across the wider teams as some of the bigger international firms. So they started to onboard individuals during the summer months. But I think it was key that in the round, litigation during the summer was busy, and I think that's important. If I flip and I look at counterparts on the finance side, probably won't surprise any of you to know that largely there were far fewer new money transactions throwing through those teams. They mentioned the asset finance team who sit under your transportation umbrella at Reed Smith. It will have been largely dictated by restructurings and refinancing, some deferrals even, which I think was alluded to earlier. So, you know, some differences there, different kind of work for the guys on the finance guys, but not unsurprising. A lot of clients who were obviously seeking the best possible advice were looking for a senior pair of eyes on their particular dilemmas and the best way to handle those particular situations and manage those restructurings or otherwise. I think then, as we started to turn into the autumn months, namely I would say by September, so we're still talking pre-vaccine or news of a vaccine, we started to see some of the bigger players in the market proactively reach out to us, understand, quite interestingly, I suppose, from their perspective, which they did throughout, how others in the market, how their peers and their competitors were handling and responding to the current climate, whether they were hiring. But it was quite consistent that from the autumn months, and this is still the case, most of those big hitters, big players in the market started to ramp up an interest in understanding if there were the right people out there. I would say broadly and generally throughout this time, what has become apparent is in an incredibly busy market, which there were some very busy times ahead of this, people are probably more willing to compromise on background, transferable experience, and not necessarily regimentally fixed to a square peg in a square hole. I think the hires that we've done during this period, given the level of senior focus and management attention on cost and on onboarding into the team, they've been very clear all round, both on the in-house and private practice side, to hire people with transferable value. And that sounds very basic, but it's people who are quite known to each other, working on the other side of transactions, perhaps those who've spent some time, whether it be secondment or otherwise. So there was a level of familiarity with the offering, which I suppose would therefore justify the cost on the other side and the value proposition, which I think the focus. That is still to some extent the case. I think we've seen a significant shift, as we probably have all have felt, just in terms of the wider sentiment in the market since news of a vaccine being approved in the last 2-3 weeks. We've started to see a flurry, is perhaps overshooting it, but a number of people lining up hiring considerations in both the new calendar year, which is frighteningly close, but even proactively thinking about the new financial years, depending on how they work out with the respective offerings. So it's very much now, and I think those individuals who've got one eye on hiring, one eye on budgets for next year, financial year or otherwise, are very keen now to understand who is out there, possibly, and indeed they are, setting up proactive discussions with those in mind. So yeah, there's definitely been a shift, not just from the autumn, almost a two-pronged shift from both the autumn time and indeed, obviously, the last 2-3 weeks when a vaccine has been approved, i.e. it may be a slow end to this, but we are at some point going to be talking about COVID past tense, which I think is good news for all. I think probably one other thing that may well be pertinent for all to hear about, because it impacts and affects us. Andrew alluded to Zoom and how we've had to all embrace this remote working element. I've got 2 young children, so if you hear screaming in the background, apologies, but we've all had to manage during this period, and there's been a remote element. I think the transition and the handling and how that is bridged in terms of returning to normal life, if you can say that. I don't think normal will ever look quite the same as it did before all this, but it will be understanding how the partners, general counsels, heads of legal, whoever they may be, how they manage that transition back into working life when people go back to meeting, to traveling, to meeting clients in person, because there have been struggles on the other side, understanding utilisation, how to allocate work to juniors who may well have just joined and been onboarded into the team. It's not been without challenges. And I think everyone has a slightly different tact and idea on what flexibility, and seemingly there will be more on the other side of that, but how that is handled and how that transition is probably going to cause some flux and tension, which from experience can often prompt people to move or indeed be moved. So I think that will be interesting to see on the other side of this, how that plays out. I can't hear you, Andrew. I think you might be on mute.
Thanks. That's great, because that was going to be a question that we'd had in the audience about what do you expect recruitment market to be like in the future and long term. So that leads us very nicely into the Q&A. Thank you so much for that. It was really interesting. It's great to get the overview that you provide as a recruitment consultant, in a way, to see how things are developing across the different sectors. There's a question that Francesca is going to ask to Alex and or Revecca. And I think, sure, Francesca, you're on mute. Let me try to... there we go. There we go.
Actually, my question was for Ross, but I think he has answered the question, is whether basically he did expect any of these, changes in the recruitment market to basically stay in the long terms. And he said it probably would be interesting to see what happens, but what does he actually expect to happen? Does he expect more flexible working? Does he expect people to be perhaps working overseas more?
It is a good question, and you're right. I don't think my expectations are, it's a tough one to call, but there will be a mixed bag. I think personally, on the other side of this, people have had to reluctantly, in certain instances,
sure,
to individuals in the market, embrace flexibility. So on the one hand, we've proven to a degree that it can work. So all of those flexible working conversations prior to this, guess what? When it had to work, it has worked, hasn't it? There's been, of sorts, there's been the ability to implement some of the infrastructure and systems to make sure that we can continue and have successfully worked during this period. However, as I mentioned, I think some individuals, not all, far from it, have done so because they've needed to rather than they've wanted to. So I think the moment that starts to shift, i.e. it becomes safe to bring people back into the office and the office environment, there undoubtedly will be offerings, private practice or in-house, who will gravitate towards doing that. I still think, as I mentioned to and I alluded to beyond, there will be more flexibility than there was before, because quite simply people have been able to prove, as I keep saying, that it can be done. So the arguments slightly diminish. But I think there is and there will always be value in having people there in person, whether it's working together, collaborative, or whether it's meeting people. I think to answer your question as well, there will be other people who totally are already making the right noises about totally embracing flexibility. So yes, you'll still see some presence in and around offices. I think, there'll be probably an initiative, I'm preempting this, but at some point to get people back into the city, because there's a ripple effect on economic and business impact in not having people in towns and office spaces, isn't there? But I think it will be very interesting to see, and you alluded to it, what the impact of people who were relocating for international roles because of a specific skill set, whether it's now dictated that because of this flexibility and the way we work remotely, people will now be considered working remotely for those international roles. I think that's something
fascinating.
Time will tell. That's going to be really interesting, I think.
That's great. Francesca, I also really liked your other question. If you want to put that to Alex and Revecca. I
didn't really. Oh. It's not me. I don't think it's me.
Well, it came in on the chat. Have the clubs seen an increase in claims or an increase in claims quantum?
I can. Revecca, would you like to?
I'm happy for you to go, and I don't mind.
Sure. I mean, from the broker side, we see it across all different markets, all different clubs. So it's quite interesting in trying to get them to reconcile a position. The comments that we've received from many of the clubs has been that the number of claims hasn't particularly increased, but the quantum has. And the reason for that is because of the difficulties in logistics. So, for example, many of the seafarers are Filipino, and Manila implemented a 14-day quarantine upon entry into the country. And so most crew contracts are a door-to-door basis when you contract in the Philippines. So getting a crew member back, your liability doesn't finish until you get them back home. So the quantum of claim has kind of increased, because firstly you've got to wrestle with the airline availability and the timetables, and then upon entering into Philippines you then increase your cost, because you then have to look after that crew member in a hotel, food, accommodation for 2 weeks before they can get back home, rather than just the straight back home and then for ongoing medical treatment for whatever it may be. Revecca, have you seen that?
Yeah, I agree. Definitely handling, I mean, crew claims and repatriations, whether it's a COVID positive test or another type of illness, have become really difficult to logistically handle. Like Alex said, instead of getting a commercial flight back, we might be having to charter private flights with extra doctors on board. When crew members are getting home, the longer quarantine periods that we're having to pay for. So it's definitely made it more difficult, more expensive. We're also trying, I think clubs as a whole are trying to look back and work out it. You know, some COVID cases are obvious that it's a COVID case. Others, you know, how much has COVID contributed to certain cases. So it's actually quite difficult to say at the moment how much and how much COVID has contributed to extra claims, but it's something definitely we're going to be looking at. But I agree, we've been busier, and there are definitely some COVID claims that we can point at to say that, you know, that wouldn't have happened otherwise. But we're looking at everything as a whole.
That's great.
And also for the non-COVID claims as well, because I think this year is the worst pool year. So when I say pool, those are the claims that are above the 10 million individual club retention before they enter into the pool of claims being shared across all the clubs in the international group reinsurance program. And it has been the worst year on record. Even though this year hasn't even finished yet, it's still superseding a lot of the 2015, 16 and 17 policy years, both in quantum and number of claims. I think over 15 have now been declared, which have had a big impact on it. So, and those, a lot of them are, you know, navigational claims, which have had nothing to do with COVID as a causation. It's just that COVID has been a complicating factor. So getting people in the right places, quarantine restrictions, visa applications. Singapore, for example, you're not allowed to enter unless you are a resident or have a long-term employment pass. So you can't get, I mean, Singapore's lucky it has a lot of expertise where it is, but in those remote, far-to-reach areas, it's very difficult to get the right people in the right places.
That's fascinating. I've certainly seen an uptick in sort of demurrage disputes and things like that were dead for years, and now because of the amount of time that things can drag on with a sub issue of COVID, often there are bigger claims out there. Thinn, I wanted to leave the last sort of question to you before Francesca wraps up. But essentially, I wanted to ask. Obviously, we're all working from home. We've covered it already with Ross and Francesca. But in terms of your work with your clients, do you think you see different expectations now from clients? And do you think that will feed into the overall market approach to where people work from?
Sorry, was that a question for me?
Yes, sorry.
Yes, sorry, I just wanted to confirm that. So in terms of, sorry, could you repeat that, please?
No problem. You were probably busy checking an email from a client or something, no doubt. The question was, we're obviously all working from home, and Ross and Francesca have spoken about that quite a bit. But when you are dealing with clients who are also probably at home, do you think that their expectations have changed, and whether they are bothered by seeing their lawyer in an attic room or wherever it may be is not so much an issue now, which may have a ripple effect on the approach generally to how lawyers, whether in a club or in private practice, work?
I've definitely seen, so in terms of sort of on a day-to-day basis, I think that we have, you know, and we've noticed this across the board, is that we have more daily contact actually with clients. And that might be because everyone is at home, not directly with their team. And so I think everyone is more willing to actually pick up the phone or start a video call. And, you know, everyone's in the same boat. Everyone's at home. It might be in their living room. It might be in the spare room. So it's been actually good to have the opportunity to kind of connect with our clients in a way that we actually wouldn't ordinarily necessarily do when everyone's in the office. In terms of expectations, I mean, I think this is probably true across the board. My friends who are non-lawyers as well, hours have definitely increased. You know, our computers are all right there. No one can go anywhere. No one has any plans really. And so, you know, I think with that, it's beneficial in that actually you can flex it though to what suits you. So if you do have children or if you've got other commitments, you know, the benefit of a law firm anyway has always been that we have that flexibility and we have the system set up. And I think our clients are definitely moving towards that as well. And so hopefully that will continue. And even this morning, got sort of summoned for a call, which was at 9 a.m, arranged 2 hours before. And that was a mix of people sitting in a boardroom in an office and other people being patched in. So, you know, everyone at home, but dressed a bit more casually. So I think that's something that is likely to continue happening.
That's fascinating. Thank you. So on that, I'm going to thank the speakers, but really it's for Francesca to do it. I thought you were all excellent and I really enjoyed listening to you. Thank you. And over to Francesca.
Sure. First of all, a huge thank you to you, Andrew, and to 4PAM Court for hosting and organizing the event, and to all the speakers for giving up their time and efforts in preparing such interesting, informative, and very clear presentations. I must say that, you know, I found it extremely clear, the message, and actually even the roles. I think it was quite interesting to see how the market has changed from a broking perspective, a club perspective, and then obviously the law firm perspective, which is what I'm more familiar with. And they're definitely challenging time for all of us. And I think on this note, I would also like to take this opportunity to invite you all, because obviously we're going virtual as well. We can't host our annual Christmas party, so we're having a virtual Christmas party on the 18th of December, and you're all very, very welcome to join. And Gerard will circulate the invite very shortly after the seminar, but in the meantime, I thought I'll let you know about it. I'm sure that firms are organizing all sorts of things in clubs. I've seen magician show, but here we're having a gin tasting event, so I hope people will, you know, be interested, and, you know, hopefully we could catch up next week again before Christmas.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.